What if one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the 21st century ends up being remembered not for what it achieved, but for everything it unintentionally changed? History is full of leaders who believed they could reshape the international order through military force. Some expanded their countries. Others accelerated transformations they never intended. More than 4 years after Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the conflict has evolved far beyond a conventional war over territory. It has become a case study in how modern warfare can reshape alliances, defense industries, regional influence, and national economies all at the same time, regardless of how the fighting ultimately ends. One question has become increasingly difficult to ignore: has the war strengthened Russia's long-term strategic position, or has it fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape in ways that may ultimately reduce Moscow's influence? That question is at the center of today's documentary. To understand why this debate matters, it helps to begin long before the current battlefield. For years, Russian leaders argued depended on maintaining influence across its immediate neighborhood and preventing further expansion of Western military institutions toward its borders. In numerous public speeches, President Vladimir Putin described Ukraine as occupying a uniquely important place in Russia's history, culture, and security environment. Many analysts therefore viewed Ukraine not simply as another neighboring country, but as a central element in Moscow's broader vision of regional stability and strategic depth. Where Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, many observers expected a relatively short campaign. Instead, the conflict evolved into Europe's largest land war since the end of the Second World War. Years later, despite significant military operations by both sides, large sections of the front remain heavily contested. Independent assessments indicate that the war has imposed enormous costs on both Russian and Ukrainian lives, military equipment, infrastructure, and economic resources. At the same time, it has transformed the security calculations of governments far beyond Eastern Europe. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence has been Ukraine's own transformation. Before the invasion, Ukraine relied heavily on foreign military assistance and imported defense equipment. Over time, however, the country began rapidly expanding domestic production of drones, electronic warfare systems, battlefield software, and other defense technologies. Public reporting from governments, research organizations, and defense analysts suggests that Ukraine has become one of the world's fastest innovators in the field of unmanned systems, driven largely by the demands of an intense and prolonged conflict. Rather than simply importing military solutions, Ukraine increasingly began developing technologies adapted to the realities of modern high-intensity warfare. That evolution has also influenced Ukraine's international partnerships. Since the start of the war, numerous bilateral security agreements have been signed between Ukraine and European governments, covering long-term military cooperation, training, intelligence sharing, industrial collaboration, and reconstruction planning. Although Ukraine remains outside NATO, these agreements have created a broad network of institutional relationships that many analysts believe will continue long after active combat eventually ends. In practice, Ukraine has become far more integrated into European security planning than many would have predicted before 2022. The country's rapidly expanding defense industry has attracted attention well beyond Europe. Public announcements during 25 and 26 highlighted growing cooperation between Ukraine and several Middle Eastern countries in areas including unmanned aerial systems, electronic warfare, and air-defense technologies. These partnerships illustrate a broader trend that defense economists increasingly discuss battlefield innovation as becoming an export sector. Countries facing evolving security challenges are seeking practical experience from nations that have operated under sustained combat conditions. And Ukraine has accumulated a level of operational knowledge that few countries possess. The economics behind this transformation are equally significant. Modern conflicts have demonstrated that relatively inexpensive drones can threaten equipment worth millions of dollars. As a result, governments around the world have begun reassessing long-established assumptions about procurement, air defense, and battlefield survivability. Analysts frequently point to the war in Ukraine as one of the clearest examples of how relatively low-cost technologies can reshape military planning. Regardless of which country ultimately benefits commercially, the conflict has accelerated changes that defense industries worldwide are now racing to understand. While Ukraine has been adapting, Russia has faced a different set of strategic challenges. Military operations on the scale seen since 2022 require enormous financial, industrial, and human resources, public economic data, alongside assessments from international financial institutions and independent economists. suggest that Russia has significantly expanded defense spending while simultaneously managing inflationary pressures, labor shortages, and shifting export markets. Although the Russian economy has shown resilience in several sectors, many analysts argue that sustaining elevated wartime expenditures over many years inevitably creates difficult trade minus-offs between military priorities and civilian investment. Those pressures extend beyond economics into diplomacy. Since the beginning of the war, several regions that Russia has traditionally regarded as central to its sphere of influence have become increasingly active in diversifying their foreign relationships. Developments in the South Caucasus, Central Asia, and other neighboring regions suggest that governments are pursuing more balanced foreign policies, expanding cooperation not only with Russia but also with the European Union, Turkey, China, the United States, and regional organizations. This does not necessarily mean that Russian influence has disappeared. Rather, many observers argue that influence is becoming more competitive than it was in previous decades. Armenia provides one example frequently cited by regional specialists. Political developments over the past several years have reflected growing debate inside the country regarding future security arrangements and relations with both Moscow and Western partners. Azerbaijan has likewise pursued an increasingly independent regional strategy while expanding diplomatic engagement with multiple international actors. Across Central Asia, governments continue strengthening economic ties with China while simultaneously seeking broader relationships with Europe, the Gulf states, and South Asia. Each individual decision may appear incremental, but together they suggest a broader pattern of strategic diversification. Whether these shifts represent temporary adjustments or lasting geopolitical realignment remains an open question. International politics rarely moves in a straight line, and great powers often recover influence after periods of contraction. Yet one conclusion has become increasingly difficult to dismiss. The war has not only changed military realities on the battlefield, it has accelerated political, economic, and technological changes across multiple regions simultaneously. Those changes are shaping the strategic environment in ways that extend far beyond Ukraine itself. And understanding those broader consequences is essential to understanding the conflict as a whole. In Part 2, we'll examine how these wider changes intersect with Russia's domestic economy, demographic pressures, relationships with major partners such as China, and the longer minus-term strategic questions that analysts continue debating as the war enters yet another year. As the conflict has continued, another question has moved to the forefront of international debate: what are the long minus-term consequences for Russia itself? Measuring those consequences is far more complicated than counting territorial changes on a battlefield. Economists, military analysts, and political scientists often emphasize different indicators, and many caution that the full effects of a prolonged war may not become clear for years. Even so, several broad trends have emerged from publicly available data and research. One area receiving significant attention is Russia's wartime economy. Since 2022, defense production has expanded substantially, with increased government spending directed toward military procurement, ammunition manufacturing, and industrial output related to national security. This investment has supported certain sectors of the economy and helped maintain employment in parts of the defense industry. At the same time, many economists note that sustained wartime spending also creates trade minus-offs. Resources devoted to military production cannot be invested elsewhere, and governments must balance defense priorities with infrastructure, healthcare, education, and long minus-term economic development. Different institutions reach different conclusions about how sustainable this balance may be, particularly if military expenditures remain elevated over an extended period. Inflation and labor availability have also become recurrent topics in economic analysis. Public statistics released by Russian authorities, international financial institutions, and independent researchers do not always present identical assessments, but many agree that labor shortages have become an increasingly important challenge. Demographic trends that predated the war, combined with migration and military mobilization, have placed additional pressure on parts of the labor market. Businesses in manufacturing, construction, transportation, and technology have all reported recruitment difficulties at various points during the conflict, although the scale of these challenges remains a subject of ongoing debate. Beyond economics, the war has also influenced Russia's diplomatic environment. International relationships rarely remain static during prolonged conflicts, and many neighboring countries have sought to diversify their foreign policies. In the South Caucasus, governments have expanded engagement with multiple international partners while continuing to manage relations with Moscow. Across Central Asia, cooperation with China, the European Union, Turkey, and Gulf states has grown alongside long-standing ties with Russia. Analysts differ on whether these developments represent a permanent geopolitical shift or simply a period of strategic balancing. But few dispute that regional diplomacy has become more diversified than it was before 2022. China occupies a particularly important place in these discussions. Since Western sanctions expanded, economic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing has increased in several sectors, including trade and energy. For Russia, China has become an increasingly significant commercial partner. For China, Russia represents one component of a much broader global economic strategy. Researchers disagree about how balanced this relationship is. Some describe it as a pragmatic partnership built on mutual interests, while others argue that differences in economic size and global market access have gradually shifted leverage toward Beijing. Regardless of interpretation, most observers agree that the relationship has become more strategically important for both countries than it was prior to the war. Meanwhile, European security has undergone its own transformation. Defense spending has increased across much of the continent. Governments have accelerated procurement of military equipment. A cooperation on intelligence, logistics, and industrial production has expanded. Finland and Sweden's decisions to join NATO marked one of the most significant changes to Northern European security architecture in decades. Supporters describe these developments as responses to changing security conditions, while critics argue they contribute to longer-term military competition. Either way, the European strategic landscape today differs substantially from that of the early 2022s. Ukraine's own evolution remains one of the most closely studied aspects of the conflict. Beyond battlefield developments, the country has expanded domestic defense production, invested heavily in unmanned systems, electronic warfare, and digital command technologies, and deepened security cooperation with numerous international partners. Defense researchers increasingly point to the conflict as an example of how rapidly military innovation can occur under sustained operational pressure. Many of the technologies developed or refined during the war are now influencing defense planning well beyond Eastern Europe. Yet despite these changes, many of the war's most important questions remain unanswered. Military operations continue, diplomatic negotiations have produced only limited progress, and analysts continue to disagree about possible long-term outcomes. Some believe the conflict could eventually settle into a prolonged period of strategic competition even after major combat ends. Others argue that future political decisions, economic conditions, or changes in international relations could alter the trajectory in ways that are difficult to predict today. History suggests that wars are rarely remembered solely for battlefield victories or defeats. They are also remembered for the institutions they reshape, the alliances they create or weaken, the technologies they accelerate, and the political choices they force upon governments around the world. In that sense, the conflict in Ukraine has already become more than a regional war. It has influenced debates about military strategy, energy security, industrial resilience, economic interdependence, and the future of the international order. Exactly how history will judge this period remains uncertain, and responsible analysis requires acknowledging that uncertainty. Many of today's developments are still unfolding, while others will only become fully visible years after the fighting ends. What is already clear, however, is that the war has altered strategic calculations across Europe and beyond. Governments, militaries, businesses, and researchers are all adapting to a security environment that looks markedly different from the one that existed before 2022. Whatever conclusions future historians ultimately reach, the decisions made during this conflict are likely to shape international politics for decades to come.